What's up, DE students? Mr. Martinez here again, and this is History Talks. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of History Talks, your lectures that are in your DE class that you can go through as many times as you need to at your own pace. Now, this episode is going to be focusing on the progressive era. As a quick recap, we've talked about the intro of industrialization. We've talked about the titans of industry. We've talked about the new labor force and the new American society within cities. And today we're going to be talking about the changes that are coming out from this industrial revolution that are called the progressive era. What is the progress that America is hoping to make in this new industrialized society? That is going to be what we're focusing on today's episode. Let's go ahead and take a look at exactly what those objectives are. As you can see on my screen right here, like I mentioned, we're talking all about what is progressive era. We're also going to talk about the nature of progressivism, also the goals, methods, and various groups of people who make up this progressive movement. We're also going to talk about the struggle of women's rights as the battle of suffrage movement starts during this time. And we're also going to talk about the expansion of government responsibilities, regulations, and reform, as many of these progressive reformers will look at the government into wanting to take on more responsibilities for the well-being of society. Overall, our question is, how does industry and technology impact society? This is a really good essential question for this episode, as both will definitely play a role in this impact. So let's go ahead and remind ourselves of the American industrial problem that we've been talking about in class. By the late 1800s, the United States industrial output and GDP was growing faster than that of any other country in the world. Many people aspire to join the nation's economic success, as 27.5 million immigrants came to the United States from 1865 to 1918 to be a part of the industrial sector. Despite such progress, life was not easy. Conditions were very poor and sometimes very dangerous. These are things that we've mentioned before in our document analysis, if you remember, when we talked about the long days and hours that these workers had in these industrial jobs, where they were expected to work 12-hour days, 7 days a week. They did not get time off, and if you were sick or injured on the job, you would simply not have that job any longer. There was no protection of employment within this time period. Along with that, the dangers of the job were very intense, not only, of course, for adults, but even for children and child labor that comes from this time. And once they returned home, we've talked about the issues within the living conditions they have, as far as tenement homes, lack of sanitization, ventilation, that's leading to a lot of diseases and unexpected problems within the city. With all these problems, there hasn't been much solutions that have been brought to government at this time. If you take a look right here, President Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harris, and even McKinley himself practically did nothing to end these ruthless tactics of rich tycoons. We've talked about how free enterprise has really let free this new level of capitalism, but we have not seen any checks and balances systems or regulations from government. And the reason why is because these presidents have felt that the nation's industry was doing more good than the nation's issues that were coming from it. They also never looked beyond the economic factors of the Gilded Age. So the monetary value of the new industrial power we create seems to outweigh the consequences that are happening for many who are being a part of this industrial system. These presidents did not see an issue with trying to counteract this balance. Some other things that we need to acknowledge that are also developing these problems is the level of political corruption that is happening, that is enriching politicians at the local level who are not are being essentially paid to look the other way with a lot of these societal and economic issues that are at the expense of lower and working classes. By 1900, 90% of the wealth in our nation is now being controlled by 10% Americans. If you look at my chart in the top right-hand corner, you'll see what I mean visually by this economic distribution of wealth. And we're doing a bit of a comparison from 1774 as the blue bar, 1860 for the orange or red bar, and green being our most relevant, which is 2011. As you guys can see, between the different classes, there is a unequal balance of wealth that is being distributed, as we're seeing many of those top 20% having such vast amounts of the wealth and very little of it making it down to the bottom 40% or even the middle 40%. Though in 1940, the first legislation was enacted by US Congress to counter concentrations of power that interfered with economic competition and trade, this being called the Sherman Antitrust Act, it was not enforced on violators. There was that one attempt that we saw, but that attempt is not being utilized when not enforced on those who are breaking these rules on unfair practices. This is leading to the idea that these titans of industry have become too large or too powerful for maybe even a government authority to be able to ring them in. There's a lot of people who start to feel this way, as you can see from the political cartoon on the bottom by Thomas Nast, who's illustrating how wealthy these individuals are and how they make the government and those who are supposed to regulate them so small. This is the problems that we're kind of starting to see that has built up and not been solved by previous administrations at this time. Some other not glamorous things about the Gilded Age is the products that are coming out. We've talked about the benefit of being able to have industrialized manufactured goods, but we haven't talked about the quality reduction that happens within them, especially without regulation to ensure quality production. Product quality started to decline during this time. Those robber barons or titans of industry started to cut corners to be able to make as much money as possible, even at the expense of the consumer. Workers didn't care about the product, just the paycheck. So workers did not feel inclined to also have some accountability with the product being made. And overall, this led to a lot of toxic and dangerous products being sold without supervision. We've talked a lot about all these different products that come out that are clearly not good for consumers that we understand now. But back then were either not understood or chose to not look into it any further as it was not economically beneficial. My picture right here gives a good illustration of what we mean by reduced product quality. As you can see here, this is a loaf of bread with a mouse in it. We're going to talk a lot about different levels of reduced product value, especially one from the jungle that represents the meatpacking industry. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Before we start talking about that progressive era, let's make sure we all understand this checkpoint question. What are the negative effects from Industrial Revolution? From what you've heard and what you know from previous lectures, what is the growing problems that we're seeing both economically and socially within American industrial society? Go ahead and answer that before we continue. Well done. Let's go ahead and move on with now the change that comes. What is the progressive era? Let's start there. Well, what we need to know is from 1980s to 1920s, there's going to be an intense social and political reform aimed at making progress towards better society. We're going to start to see a lot of individual Americans who start to bring themselves onto the forefront of demanding change in different areas. These progressive era reformers sought to harness the power of the federal government to eliminate unethical and unfair business practices, to reduce corruption, and to counteract the negative social problems of industrialization. These are the three main goals that we're seeing from generally these reformers. There's a lot of different elements to them, but in a general sense, this is what they're aiming to do. And they all see the solution being that the federal government needs to be more responsible for these things. Make a note that they said federal government, not state government, as they feel that state government and making every state come along to these regulations would take too long, that it needs to be a unified front around all of our nation being ran by the central government authority. Here are some key progressive reformers that we're going to recognize in this class. People like Jane Addams, for example, who founded the Whole House in Chicago, which helped immigrants adapt to life in the United States, teaching them the ways of dress and socialization and how to be a part of our society here in America. Other people like Grace Abbott, who improved the rights of immigrants and the child welfare, bringing attention to the inequality that maybe existed between those subgroups. And also other people like Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, who are the founders of the National Suffrage Association, which is aiming for acquiring women's voting rights, which at this point we understand is still an exclusive thing for only a few Americans. We are now starting to see a push from the female movement that is demanding for equality within this political representation. This women's suffrage movement is such a huge moment in American history, and the battle it took to acquire this is so great. I would like us to watch this video to kind of illustrate the level of battle that had to happen to be able to convince not only public opinion, but also government opinion to finally allow women to vote in America. Also keep note on who exactly is being represented in the suffrage movement. Is it all women or is it a selective group? Let's watch this video that's going to help us answer these kind of questions. Perfect, thank you. And as you guys can see, this struggle was a big one that took a long time. Let's go ahead and move on, shall we? So in this progressive era that we're talking about, there's going to be a lot of individual Americans who are going to take up this aim of trying to help change America. Some of them we'll call the progressive era reformers, like we just mentioned. And then there's this other group of people that we do need to recognize as well, who are called muckrakers. What makes the difference between these muckrakers and what is the progressive era reformers that we just mentioned are going to be these key things. Muckrakers were typically journalists and novelists who expose corruption in big business and government. These individuals, these journalists and novelists, made a point to expose the rough parts of America and the negative effects of industrialization that was happening on living and working conditions, and bringing public awareness to it and demanding a change from it. As you can hear, the word itself is kind of a funny one, muckrakers, and it actually is coined by a president that we'll be talking about in this unit, who is Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt. In a speech in 1906, he was quoted for saying that the men of the muckrakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society, but only if they knew when to stop raking the muck. Raking the muck merely just refers to the practice of investigative journalists and activists who bring up unpleasant facts. As you can hear from Teddy Roosevelt, he has an appreciation for them, but he also worries about how much is being exposed and figuring out what is the balance between the two. We'll talk much more about Teddy Roosevelt and his support for the progressive era movement, but this is where the name comes from, if you were curious. Let's talk about some of these key muckrakers, these key journalists and novelists who made a point to look at the rough parts of American society and demanded change from it. There's going to be a few that we're going to talk about. The first one is going to be Jacob Riis, as you can see here. He is a Danish immigrant who published a photo essay called How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements New Yorkers. Him being a photojournalist himself, he made a point to use the new technology of photography to capture exactly what was this life like. You have to understand at this point, there's both racial and economic segregation among the classes that's leading to some people, especially those who have influence and power, not being aware of the most abysmal parts of American society, or at least who are having a blind eye to it. Jacob Riis makes a point to document these different things of harsh living conditions that happen to not only recent immigrants, but also other Americans who are in New York City. And he brings out this photography and brings out awareness to all of the dark parts of our American society within the living conditions. Matter of fact, it brings so much public awareness, these photos he takes, like you see below, that brings so much attention to how life can be for those on the bottom, that he does inspire the city itself to create a law called the New York Tenement House Act of 1901, which required tenement houses to be safer, cleaner, and more spacious versus how cramped, dark, and unsanitary that they once were. This was a big deal for the well-being of those lower classes. Another muckraker that we're going to highlight is Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell is an investigative journalist from Pennsylvania who was hoping to expose John D. Rockefeller after he had destroyed her father's small oil business. We've talked about Rockefeller himself being one of the titans of industry. We've talked about his levels of acquiring the oil sector and dominating it with both horizontal and vertical integration. This person right here is bringing out the unfair practices that come out of it, as her family being a victim of the practices that were being used that destroyed her family's small oil business. She ends up writing this book called The History of the Standard Oil Company to highlight on those unfair monopoly practices. And when bringing this up and bringing out the report, it was then used later in a Supreme Court decision in 1911 that then was clearly showing that Rockefeller was violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then forced his company to break up the oil business into 34 separate companies, the companies that we do see today. This is what happens to Rockefeller as this muckraker brings up the different levels of business practices that are happening and brings up the fact that these violators are not being brought to justice. But this report and the awareness that comes from it starts to demand such rules to be enforced. For me, I'm particularly impressed with someone like this who is able to stand up to one of the biggest Goliaths that we have in the economic system. Another muckraker we'll talk about is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair is a really interesting one. Upton Sinclair is an American writer that writes a book called The Jungle. And the initial intent of this book is very different than what ends up being the result. The original intention of his investigation was to follow a Lithuanian immigrant who arrived to Chicago to be a part of the meatpacking district, determined to live out the American dream that he has heard from across the Atlantic. At first, his solution to everything is to work hard, yet the system eventually breaks him down. Among other calamities, he is laid off after being injured on the job, his wife is raped and then dies in childbirth. He is in jail, his house is repossessed, and his young son drowns in the streets. This entire book that captures the misery and the potential American nightmare that can follow some of these immigrants is then brought to America's attention, but not in the way that Upton Sinclair wanted. Like you can see from the caption below, he said, "I aimed at the public's heart and I accidentally hit the stomach." And that's true, as out of all from that book that he wrote, what was brought up most as a national's what was brought up most from the nation was the accounts he had about contamination of meats. Contamination of meat with rotten meat, toxic chemicals, dust, and other species parts that were put in meat that was not intended to be there. This is very gross. His capture of it is very intense, as he's talking about not only how animal parts and rats are all among this meat that's not meant to be there, leaving their droppings on the meat that is then sold, or cancerous meat being sold and not being disposed of, or the some accounts that happen where children and even some adults will lose parts of their body in the hopper machines that are creating the meat. And instead of ending the meat product line, they would just push along the meat even to consumers, even if it had human parts in it. This was the level of contamination that was brought up in his book that was talking about the Lithuanian immigrant. And this was the particular part that made America feel the need to change. not change in the sake of immigrants' living conditions, but led to the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food Drug Act of 1906 that gave power to the federal government to overlook and inspect all food and drug industries and their products. As you can see, Upton Sinclair was aiming for one goal and came out with another. One, though, that we are definitely grateful for, as now we see some of this levels of safety and regulation being a part of our consumer goods that we consume. Another muckraker that we'll talk about is Ida B. Wells, another person I'm incredibly impressed with for the fact of what she was fighting for. Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in Mississippi in 1962. By 1890s, she became involved in exposing anti-lynching activism with her book, Southern Horrors, Lynching Laws or Lynch Laws in All Its Phases. This was detailing the systemic disenfranchisement of Southern Blacks and even the poor whites, talking about the different violence and atrocities that were taking place, as there was regularly these lynchings that would happen and hate crimes that would happen that would go with no legal repercussions. There would be no one who would be convicted for it. And with this surge of hate crimes that happen, with lynching, with no justice to be found for those who committed, you start to see this become a spectacle among white communities, as there was going to be a lot of gatherings that happen among the lynched victims of this time period, almost like you see from the picture below. This level of emboldened of acts that would happen with spectators then brought Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells made a point to not only document, highlight, and bring to public awareness the level of hate crimes that are being committed in the South. She also starts to be one of the founders of the National Association for Advance of Colored People, or known as the NAACP, in 1909. This is a prominent African-American organization that still exists today, but was created with the contributions of Ida B. Wells on not only creating this organization, but highlighting the atrocities that are being committed on other parts of American society. You just got a small taste of a few different muckrakers who come out during this progressive era. There are many others, of course, but from the ones you just heard, which muckraker stood out to you and why? Answer this checkpoint question before we continue. Thank you. Well done. There are some other calls for change that happen, not only from the muckrakers and the progressive era reformers, but from even the labor workers themselves. This, of course, is the birth of labor unions. Between 1881 to 1980, 35,000 workers per year will lose their lives in industrial and other accidents at works, which would lead to the call for change. And strikes were a commonplace. No fewer than 100,000 workers were on strike each year. As the working force starts to see the level of negative effects on themselves for this industrial sector, there starts to be a call or a demand for change in it for the sake of better working conditions. And there are a lot of different methods these workers use to be able to get their point across at this time period. One of them is creating unions. And if you don't know what a union is, it is an organization of workers who join together as a group to bargain with the owner of a business that employed them. At this time period, you're going to see that the unions are going to be calling for things like the 8-hour shift, higher wages, and better working conditions, or even ideas of cooperative management, where workers and laborers also have a say within the administrative sector of managing the business. These are the calls that happen from the union at this time. But as you guys have seen from our different document analysis we've done on Titans of Industry, we've seen how those Titans would respond to these unions, that there will be pushback and resistance from the business sector on reducing the amount of movement that is growing from the labor movement. And the reason why is because of strikes. Strikes was another method that these unions would use, or that these unions would use, as they would refuse to work and prevent others from leaving the factory, thus leaving the factory to be idle, not being productive or making money. These stalemates that would happen would then force the business administration to then have to consider or compromise or fight back, which we've seen happen with Pinkertons and military force coming in to stop these protests and then later riots that happen between laborers and the business sector, the administrative sector. The series of violence that happens at this time is quite a lot. There's a lot of ones we can mention, the Haymarket riot and many more, where you see labor movements make a point to draw a line on what is it that they're willing to work for and what they're willing to not work for. And you start to see the violence that happens with both police force, those Pinkertons, as you see the pushback instead of the compromise. This is going to lead to some other social developments that we'll talk about later, as a lot of these laborers are going to start to look for other economic systems that they feel would better represent laborers in being a part of the well-being of business. But these strikes, these labor unions, these start to be a big moment of pushback against those negative effects of industrialization. Now, all of this demand for change is then official when we have a president in charge who then puts this into regulation. This is going to be, of course, Theodore Roosevelt, and we're going to talk about his domestic affairs today. Theodore Roosevelt served as our president from 1901 to 1909, ascending to the office after the assassination of William McKinley. The principles that he had are similar to the Progressive Era, as he starts to create a domestic program called the Square Deal, where you're going to start to see Theodore Roosevelt trying to make a lot of domestic changes under this principle of the three C's. The three C's being consumer protection, control over corporations, and conservation. Those are going to be the main three themes of domestic changes he's hoping to make. And relatively, he does a great job of doing this. He does ring in a lot of those corporations, and he's later given the nickname the Trust Buster, as he was able to go through and be able to stop a few different industries from their unfair practices, specifically the railroads, meatpacking, and sugar industries, as he then enforced and required federal inspections. He also does get into consumer protection as he goes into those business sectors to create those reforms. And he is also given a lot of credit for the conservation that you see today in America. If you don't know what conservation is, we're talking about the protection of the environment. And this is a new concept that American society is going to start to embrace as they start to witness a lot of the nature and resources America had starting to be pulled and utilized. And when that happens, a lot of people start to worry about the amount of natural resources and the responsibility that we have to make sure that it's sustainable. Teddy Roosevelt makes this a big key factor for him as he establishes over 230 million acres of land to be then public and protected by the federal government. This, of course, is called national parks. We live by one. Yosemite is a perfect example. Matter of fact, look at that picture you see there, as that is Teddy Roosevelt himself surveying Yosemite with a progressive reformer who was helping him build up his conservation program, also known as John Muir. These are the people who then established those national parks that we see today to prevent them from being taken into industrial development and losing those resources. So from what you've just heard, how did Theodore Roosevelt himself help support the Progressive Era movement? What was the domestic policies that he pushes forward to counteract some of those negative effects that we've been mentioning? Answer this, please, before we continue. Well done. And congratulations, folks. We just finished up our lecture when it came to the progressive era. Next time in class, we're now going to personally select a few progressive era reformers and muckrakers and seeing the different other levels of change that comes from this time all around improving the well-being of America within its social, cultural, and economic levels. But for now, folks, that is it when it comes to your history talks. Thank you so much for being a part of today's lesson. I hope you learned something new, and I look forward to our next episode. I'm Mr. Martinez, and I'm signing out. Thank you so much, and see you later.